Mr. Sando has decided to give up his teaching job and run for office in Congress. This means that he can either run for W. Westerman's seat in the House of Representatives or for Bill Nelson's seat in the Senate. As his advisors, we will be weighing the pros and cons of running for each seat and then provide a recommendation of which office is in Mr. Sando's best interest.
The House of Representatives is the lower house of Congress, which is made up of 435 seats. Since representatives of the House only have a 2-year term, they can respond to the needs of the people faster. On the other hand, since they only serve 2-year terms, it's harder to consider long-term effects. Seats in the House are much less contested than in the Senate, since there are 435 seats in the House compared to 100 in the Senate. But about 90% of representatives in the House are re-elected for another term, so it will be hard for Mr. Sando to get a seat. But if he wins, he has a good chance of keeping his position for another year. Also, laws dealing with revenue, such as monetary and economic bills, must start in the House. The House also has the power to impeach federal officials and elect the president in the case of an electoral college tie.
The rotunda bridges the House and Senate sides of the Capitol. It is from here that you enter into the oldest part of the Capitol and into the Senate wing of the building. And as you make your way from the oldest part of the Capitol into the extension built in the 1850s, you see a stark contrast in the decorative nature of the old and new, as the Senate of the 1850s desired to showcase their part of the Capitol to visitors from around the world. It is into this artistic and architectural design where you find the current Senate chamber, surrounded by ornately decorated halls and rooms, and opened in the winter of 1859.
I'm always enthralled by the Senate chamber itself, the walls themselves. Well, if they could speak, what could they tell us? What would they tell us? I think of the great men and women who have served there.
And there's something special about seeing it when it's empty. It's an empty theater in a sense. There's a certain feeling. You stop, you look around, you look at the busts of the vice presidents, you look at the desks, you imagine the people who stood there, the Robert Tafts, the Lyndon Johnsons, the Hubert Humphreys, the Barry Goldwaters, the people who have really had a huge impact on this institution and on American political history. This was the chamber in which they fought their battles. And there is a certain tribute that is paid to these people in their absence in that empty chamber.
The Senate is like, it's almost a living creature as a whole, breathing. It has a tempo to it. It has an atmosphere. You can watch it and you can feel it. And it's almost like a person. And if you treat it like you would treat another person, I think it responds well. Even when you're trying to make it do something it doesn't want to do.
The real role of the Senate is to be a forum of the states. Each state is equal in the Senate in its representation. There are 2 senators from every state. Each senator is equal to a degree with any other senator. Each senator can speak as long as he or she wishes to speak. There is freedom of speech. Freedom of speech runs deep in English history, Roman history even, and colonial history and American history since the Constitution came along. Freedom of speech.
The Senate chamber opened on January 4th, 1859. On that day, members of the Senate, as a body, left their old chamber, which is now the old Senate chamber. They walked down the corridor and into their new chamber. There was excitement, there was enthusiasm about this new space. When you go into the Senate chamber today, it's a little bit hard to really evoke the way that chamber would have looked in the 19th century. It has changed so dramatically. In the 19th century, when that chamber first opened in 1859, the room was very, very Victorian. Highly ornate floral patterned carpet, filigree and gilding on the walls, and a wonderful stained glass ceiling. The Senate chamber was expanded during the 1850s, and it opened because, as new states joined the Union, more space was needed. So in the 1850s, Congress appropriated $100,000 to build the two new wings for the House and for the Senate, and then later also the Capitol Dome. When you look out from the galleries into the Senate chamber, there's a variety of things that are going on. And really, the layout that you see today is very similar to the layout in the old Senate chamber. While decorations changed, that same formality, that same layout has continued. So what you have in the center of the room is the dais. At the dais is the presiding officer's desk. In the 19th century, it would have been the vice president who would have been frequently at that desk. Nowadays, the presiding officer is more frequently a member of the majority party, and they sit at the presiding officer's desk for a period of time, basically overseeing what is going on in the chamber. You also have in the galleries, you have the press gallery above the presiding officer's desk, up there on the third floor. So again, the press can look down and see what's happening. Around you, as you look into the chamber, are other galleries, visitors gallery, diplomats gallery, even members gallery, so that specific areas for people to go to view what's going on the floor. And of course, the room is divided into the Republicans and the Democrats. If you're at the presiding officer's desk looking out towards the Senate, on the left-hand side would be the Republicans and on the right would be the Democrats. The majority leader and the minority leader are front and center, right at the front of the room in the center aisle.
When I walk into the current Senate chamber and I see 100 beautifully polished desks, I have a lot of different thoughts. One is that those desks are occupied by the latest in a long, unbroken chain of senators going back to 1789. There have been over 1,880 members of the Senate. And they really do have reflected all different kinds of shades of opinion and walks of American life.
The Senate chamber desks that you see in the Senate chamber that the members use today are probably the most unique and most important pieces in our collection as far as decorative arts, furniture. The reason being is that 48 of those desks were purchased in 1819 at a cost of $34 by New York cabinet maker Thomas Constantine.
Misuse of the hold in the Senate has become a fundamental problem, and I don't see how anybody could support the concept of secret holds.
Why did you, in both the House and the Senate, play an active role in opening up both chambers to television?
You know, I don't want to get too sanctimonious about this, but I do believe in openness in government. I generally don't like secrets of any kind. I just think life's a lot easier if you kind of live an open book. I thought it was part of the modern era. You know, we weren't, covered by media that was only pen and pencil. It was the electronic age, audio, radio, and of course that powerful medium, television. I thought that the people who couldn't come to Washington from small town USA should have a chance to see and observe what we do. In some respects, I think it has adversely affected us. I think we do have more performing for the eye of the camera. But I also think that people on occasion have seen us at our best when the debate does soar to a degree. And they see that we work at it and we have legitimate disagreements, sometimes without being disagreeable. But it was really kind of simple for me.
Well, the good is the public gets to hear the debates that are going on, and so has a first-hand, can be a first-hand witness to history, to understand exactly what's occurring, not just by reading the record, but actually hearing the voices, watching the faces of those who are the authors and architects of policy. The downside of it is it's almost theater. It's not necessarily real. We don't have as many real debates any longer because, in fact, people are aware that they're performing on a very public stage. Not that they weren't before either, but there was a limited audience. And I think that truncates the debate. I think it has a way of sort of stylizing the debate in a way that deprives people of the real negotiations and conversations that are historically a part of any legislative production.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka, Mr. Alexander, Mr. Allard, Mr. Allen,
The rules of the Senate really perplexed me when I first came over from the House. As I said, I like order, I like rules that, okay, here it is in the book, and this is what you do, and this is how you have a second-degree amendment, and all that. And I got to the Senate, and having been a member of the Rules Committee in the House, and now in the Senate, chairman in the Senate of the Rules Committee, I kept looking and watching the institution and saying, this doesn't make any sense. This is not Robert's Rules of Order. This is not the House Rules of Order. What are these rules? Finally, I went to the parliamentarian and said, explain to me. How does this place work? And he said, well, there are only really two rules that matter, exhaustion and unanimous consent. And if you get the senators exhausted enough, they'll agree unanimously to anything.
That Senate is the forum where the people speak, and where senators can speak as long as their feet will hold them. And if their feet won't hold them, they can sit down and get unanimous consent to speak at their desk. That is the protection of the people's liberties. As long as there is a place where one can speak as loudly as he wishes, and as long as his lungs will last, there we can be sure that people's liberties will endure.
It was Everett Dirksen, a Republican leader of the Senate in the 1960s, who said, thinking about the members of the Senate, what a diverse lot they are. Oh, great God, what a chore it is to try to harmonize their discordant voices, to bring them all together.
The Senate's great days of success, in my view, have not been because the rules were better or worse, but the quality of the people who served during that time and understanding the role of the United States Senate, not as a partner with the executive branch or a partner with the House, but as a unique place that has a co-equal obligation to make sure that people's voices are heard.
As you can see, Mr. Sando, the advantages of the Senate are very prolonged. In the Senate, you have 6-year terms, which means longer guaranteed job, which is a steadier job. You can consider a long-term effects of laws, and you don't have to react to public influence as much because there's usually a long time before re-election. However, the disadvantage with this is that the process in the Senate is usually slower. Seats in the Senate are also usually much more higher profile for the candidates because only 1/3 of the seats are elected every 2 years, so it's a bit harder to get a seat. However, the seats in the Senate are much more contested than the seats in the House of Representatives. This means that Mr. Sando, you, have a much better chance of taking someone else's seat. There's only 100 Senate seats compared to the 435 seats. Your opinion will be heard, unlike the 435 seats in the House of Representatives where no one can be heard. The Senate also has sole power of approval on foreign treaties and cabinet and judicial nominations, including appointments to the Supreme Court. This is very good because it gives you a lot of power since you're one vote in 100 rather than one vote in 435. However, the 100 seats does have its disadvantage, as the president is the deciding vote, not someone from the Senate. And this is one thing, is that the vice president is the deciding vote, not the Senate. And that's the one thing, is that the vice president is not part of the Senate, so he's not in all the discussions. Senators cannot become as specialized in committees as the House of Representatives because there's not enough people to specialize in certain areas. So this gives you more tasks being in the Senate. However, the Senate has the final say in the impeachment process, which gives you a lot of say because you're 1 in 100, again, being able to discuss as much as you want.
After carefully reviewing the differences between the Senate and the House of Representatives, we have decided to advise Mr. Sando to run for Bill Nelson's seat in the Senate. One main advantage is that Mr. Sando will have a better chance of winning the seat than Debbie Wasserman's seat. Senate seats are rarely contested, as 90% of incumbent representatives are reelected, so there's a strong chance Mr. Sando will have given up his teaching position in vain, while seats in the House are usually much more contested. Another reason to pursue a seat in the Senate is that it is a much steadier job, as re-election for a seat comes every 6 years, while re-election comes every 2 years for a seat in the House.
This will make sure Mr. Sando has a steady source of income for his family for a much longer guaranteed period of time. The smaller size of the Senate will allow Mr. Sando to have a more influential voice in the government that he has been teaching high schoolers about for years. Finally, the powers given exclusively to the Senate will allow him to take part in important government processes, such as the approval of foreign treaties and cabinet and judicial nominations, and the final say in the impeachment process.